Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze the main tactical themes in Benfica's 2-2 draw with Ajax in their first leg round of 16 Champions League clash. So in today's video, first we're going to focus on how both sides look to press, then we'll shift to Ajax's attacking shape, and lastly we'll focus on Benfica's adjustments, mainly in the second half. So when we break down the game and we do look at the board, we have Benfica in a 4-4-1-1 and Ajax starting in a 4-3-3. So in terms of pressing, when we do break this down, the first thing that you can identify is that Ajax does have a 3v2 advantage in that midfield zone. What you end up seeing is that you have Alvarez, Gravenberch, and Berghuis in that midfield area, and you're going to need someone to drop deeper to deal with Alvarez. Technically, that should be tasked towards Ramos, but let's say Benfica want their two strikers to step towards the center backs. That's where you can have Tyrrell and Weigl stepping forward, with one of them dealing with Alvarez, and then having one of the center backs leave Haller to step to the spare midfielder. Obviously, there are other alternatives where you could have one of the strikers blocking off the passing lane into Alvarez, or having one of the wide players tuck in to deal with the spare midfielder. But what we ended up seeing from Benfica here was that they did have their two strikers stepping towards the center backs, and while Ramos was often tasked with Alvarez, if he did need to step out towards the center back, he'd block off the passing lane in towards the deep lying midfielder. In those initial stages, we did witness some variations from Ajax. For instance, they'd have one of the fullbacks dropping off a bit deeper. We witnessed Mazraoui and at times Blind staying narrow in a deeper position, and then having the center back split into wider areas. Or there were also occasions where you witnessed Gravenberch dropping into an inside left position to get on the ball in those deeper zones. While Benfica did a fairly decent job of ensuring that Alvarez couldn't get on the ball in the early stages of the game, all Alvarez had to do was shift out into those wider areas to get the ball in towards the channels to drag away Ramos, and then they could play in the goalkeeper as well, and they ultimately have a 4v2 or a 3v2, and Benfica's press from the front was unsustainable in terms of ensuring that Alvarez couldn't get on the ball. Meanwhile, when we shift to Ajax's press, it was much more effective. What we ended up seeing was that, as expected, they had Gravenberch and Berghuis stepping towards Tyrrell and Weigl to ensure that they couldn't get on the ball, and then Alvarez was tracking the movement of Ramos, who was dropping off a bit deeper. Out in those wider areas, Haller was chasing the center back that was in possession, and then you would see Tadic and Antony stepping ahead of Gilberto and Grimaldo, blocking off the passing lane and towards them, and then looking to step towards the spare center back if he received possession. This evidently incentivizes Benfica to potentially play long and try to get the ball onto Gilberto or Grimaldo, but what you ended up seeing was that Tadic had a more deeper position just ahead of Gilberto, and it was Antony who was being a bit more adventurous by stepping towards Vertonghen. This appeared to be an intentional ploy by Ajax, because what ended up happening on a reoccurring basis was that when the ball was shifted out towards Grimaldo, he was either incapable of receiving possession calmly or being dispossessed in his own third. Even if Grimaldo did receive that ball calmly, Mazraoui was shifting over to step forward and apply pressure, and then Timbers would shift laterally to occupy Everton, as Ajax had a 2v1 advantage against Darwin. And to no surprise, it was from that pressing scheme that Ajax were able to cause Benfica several problems, and it ultimately led to their opening goal. In the build-up to Ajax's opener, focus on the long ball being played out to Grimaldo and Mazraoui shifting across as the Ajax midfield presses 3v3. Grimaldo now has to have a good first touch, because you could see that the Ajax right back is shifting over quickly, and you could see Timbers closing down Everton. However, unfortunately for Benfica, Grimaldo's first touch is poor, and that's where you see the Ajax right back stepping in, and now it allows Ajax to break free down that right channel as Antony is free just in behind him. Mazraoui wins the ball and it falls into the path of Antony, and now you can see the 2v1 as Vertonghen's pulled out of position and focus on Tadic, who's already ahead of Gilberto. As that play develops, Antony slides the ball out into Mazraoui, but because Vertonghen had to shift over and Haller is occupying Otamendi, there's a free passing option in Tadic, who's unmarked in left half space. Mazraoui picks him out, and from this position, Tadic finishes superbly into the top corner to put Ajax up 1-0. When we shift back to Ajax's attacking shape, as you can see, Benfica would drop off into two banks of four if their press was bypassed. And what we ended up witnessing was that Ajax was often attacking with 5 players. you had Blind and Mazraoui with the license to push forward. And what we witnessed down that right-hand side was that Antony was often hugging the touchline, and then Mazraoui was looking to push forward into that inside channel gap, often occupying space in between Vertonghen and Grimaldo. If he wasn't in that zone, you would witness him much deeper, and it was Berghuis who was pushing forward, looking to form a front three with Haller and Tadic, and then that's where you would end up seeing Gravenberch dropping off a bit deeper or in the gap between Tyrrell and Rafa Silva. Berghuis was often joining the attack and looking to make runs in the gaps between the fullbacks and the center backs, whereas over on the left-hand side, we witnessed different variations. At times, Tadic was hugging the touchline, or he was shifting laterally into the gap between Otamendi and Gilberto. That would allow Blind to push forward, and that's where you would see Gravenberch dropping into an inside left position to get on the ball. But as that game progressed, there were times where you ended up seeing Gravenberch shifting out into that wider zone, and then that would give Tadic more freedom to shift laterally into that Otamendi-Gilberto gap, or at times even shift laterally to the opposite side of the pitch, looking to receive the ball in space between the lines. Because on the left-hand side, you're expecting one of two things: Tadic to hug the touchline and Blind to make underlapping runs or move into that inside central narrow position, or vice versa with Tadic drifting laterally and Blind making overlapping runs to occupy advanced positions. But what we ended up witnessing was that outside of Ajax's pressing, they created very few chances, but it often stemmed through their wide play through the various positions that their advanced players were taking up. For instance, Mazraoui making runs in between Vertonghen and Grimaldo to receive long balls was a reoccurring theme, whereas over on the left-hand side, with Gravenberch looking to occupy positions near the left touchline or in that inside left position, Tadic was now able to receive a bit more space on the ball, whether it be in that left channel or in central areas between the lines, and it was the movement from those wide positions that helped Ajax get into legitimate goal-scoring positions, because out in that midfield zone, Tyrrell and Weigl did a very good job of ensuring that Gravenberch and Berghuis couldn't get time on the ball in those midfield zones. And then in the wide areas, Rafa Silva and Gilberto, along with Everton and Grimaldo, did their best in ensuring that we couldn't witness any combination play in 2v2 situations. In the build-up to Ajax's second goal, it's Blind sliding the ball across Rafa Silva into the path of Tadic, who's just ahead of Gilberto, but focus on Gravenberch's positioning. When Tadic receives the ball, now you could see Gravenberch in that left touchline zone looking to make a run across Gilberto to drag away Rafa Silva, and that creates space for Tadic to pick out the ball onto his left foot, because now Gilberto is also focused on the run of Gravenberch, and from here Tadic picks out Haller's run across Vertonghen, and Otamendi has to pick it out. He doesn't do that, and the ball bypasses the center back at the front post, and it allows Haller to use his strength and his movement to brush aside Vertonghen, and from this position he's able to direct the ball first time towards goal, and unfortunately for Benfica, the goalkeeper spills the rebound into the path of Haller, who's able to make no mistake from 6 yards out to restore the lead for Ajax. So while it was clear that Ajax were looking to attack with 5 or 6 players, what ended up happening was that Benfica were able to locate space out on the wider areas to break in transition. That was obvious in the opening half, where we witnessed Darwin looking to make runs into the gaps behind the fullbacks, and what we ended up seeing was that because Ajax's pressure was so tight, you'd witness Rafa Silva looking to drop deeper to pull out Blind, and then that would create space for Darwin or Ramos to run into. We did witness variations where at times Darwin or Ramos would shift into those zones, and then that would create space for Rafa or even Tyrrell to push into. Whereas the same could be said on the opposite flank for Timbers and Mazraoui, who encountered some issues with Ramos and Everton's movement into those wider areas. Therefore, when you shift to the second half, given that Ajax was ahead 2-1 away from home, you're expecting a more controlled performance in that period. But what we ended up seeing was that while Benfica's pressing remained unsuccessful, and now there was more space for the Ajax center backs to push forward to get into advanced positions. The issue for Ajax here was that they still were struggling to create chances outside of the movement from Gravenberch and Mazraoui, and what we ended up seeing was that they were still pushing the fullbacks and at times the center backs into advanced positions, and that created space for Rafa Silva in particular to break in transition, and Benfica were able to create several chances and ultimately equalize the game through those transitional breaks. So as you can see, Benfica had a clear threat in Rafa Silva breaking in behind Blind, but also dragging him out of position, evading his challenges with this tight pressure to get other teammates into quality positions. However, Verissimo does deserve credit for making a substitution and bringing on Yaremchuk for Everton. He placed Yaremchuk up front and then shifted Darwin out to the left-hand side, and now you had three legitimate attacking threats to break in transition with ample space in behind Alvarez and the fullbacks. Darwin also did a very good job of tracking Mazraoui's movement to protect Grimaldo. As more space was available for Ajax to break into in transition, it was their substitute that helped them equalize the game. Initially, we witnessed Benfica breaking in transition with Rafa Silva getting the ball just ahead of Daley Blind, but focus on the positioning of Alvarez and Mazraoui. As we watch that play develop, what we end up witnessing is Rafa Silva carries the ball in towards the final third. He pulls away a center back and he locates the movement of Yaremchuk in between Alvarez and Timber. Rafa Silva ends up sliding the ball across the center back into towards the path of the substitute. And from here, he has a free effort on goal with Pasveer coming off his line, and he should be doing a better job of chipping the keeper to level the game. But he ends up chipping a tame effort over the keeper, and it allows Timber to come across to clear the lines. And then in the build-up to Benfica's equalizer, focus on the positioning of Timber and Blind. The break starts from the Benfica penalty area, and it's Timber who looks to evade a challenge, and he ends up diving in the penalty area. And as we watch that play develop, what you end up seeing is that it's Rafa Silva once again breaking into the space that Blind should be occupying, and he ends up clipping the ball across Alvarez, who's shifting laterally to provide cover. And what we end up witnessing here is that, as you can see, there is cover coming across from Berghaus, but what Rafa Silva does well here is that he carries the ball down that right channel, and he identifies that Benfica has a 4v3 overload that results in the Yaremchuk equalizer. So as you can see, while Ajax's pressing created issues for Benfica in the early stages of the game, the hosts equally deserve credit for identifying space to exploit behind the Dutch side's wide players and subsequently maximizing this threat in the second half.